For me with Insomniac games, it seems the number 2 will always hold a special place in my heart. My first Spyro the Dragon game was actually this game right here, Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, and my first ever Ratchet & Clank game as well was Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando. I'm pretty sure once I play Spider-Man 2, once that comes out, that will also finally get me to start trying out Spider-Man games more often than not. So yes, we're back with more Spyro the Dragon. This time, a little more rage-filled, and a little bit more of a gateway to a glimmering new world. Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage was created and developed by Insomniac Games, published by Universal Interactive Studios in 1999 for the PlayStation 1. In European regions, it is known as Gateway to Glimmer, due to how the game's story has you start off in the first world of the game, Glimmer. Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage is interesting because it takes everything that Spyro 1 had done and refines it to almost perfection. One thing I can always count on with Insomniac Games is a sequel for one of their games. The second game generally polishes a lot of things that were done well in the first game and makes it much more enjoyable in the second game. What do I mean by that? We'll get more into that once we get into the gameplay, but what's my history with Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage? I first played this game at a friend's house back in elementary school. I never had a PlayStation 1 until later on, but this would also be one of the first PlayStation 1 games I would end up getting myself once I eventually did get a PlayStation of my own. Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage was a very interesting game because the voice acting has upgraded itself, the story is more present, and the levels are much more varied with intro and outro cutscenes galore. One thing I love about Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage as well is the length of the game in general. It's not too long, it's not too short, and it feels just right to 100% it every time I play. I've played this game so many times, it's kind of concerning actually. I think if we were to take the Naughty Dog and Insomniac Games repertoire from the PlayStation 1 and put them side by side, I will always say that I will prefer the Spyro the Dragon series, and most of that is in part due to how often I would play Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage as a child. It shaped a lot of what I wanted in a game for a collectathon, and it's something that I always have fun going back to whenever I haven't played it in a while. But enough about that. Instead of starting with the story, since the story takes a lot more of a focus in this game, we're actually going to start off with the gameplay tweaks and gameplay enhancements that have started in Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, and then we'll move on to story and sound design. So, without further ado, let's get started. Gameplay for Spyro the Dragon was identified in the first game. You go around levels, collecting hidden collectibles, and finding the end of the stage to progress to the next world based on the certain number of collectibles you have. Spyro 2 sort of takes a different approach in terms of how his level layout is set up. Instead of having wide open areas with hidden collectibles inside that you have to try and decipher and find, in Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, and really for the rest of the series going forward, you have a clear start and end point of a level. And inside that level, you have different challenges in order to complete to get other collectibles. What are the collectibles in this game? Well, you have the returning gems that are scattered all over the floor, inside crates and inside jars, but you also have new orbs to collect based on doing mini games and different objectives throughout a level, and the level's talisman, which is to get to the end of the level and solve whatever problem is going on in that world that you're currently in. Now, Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage doesn't fully go through with all levels having talismans. Some levels, such as the returning speedways, have just orbs inside of them or gems to collect in general. Now, when it comes to collecting orbs, you really don't know the importance of them if you've been going through the levels and ignoring most challenges until you get to the final home world out of the 3 that are in the game, known as Winter Tundra. In Winter Tundra, you're required to have at least 40 orbs out of the 64 orbs that are inside of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage in order to fight the final boss. Upon beating the final boss, you unlock the main objective of the game, which is Dragon Shores, And upon getting every orb and every gem inside the game, of which there are 10,000 gems and 64 orbs, you will unlock a permanent power-up to your flame breath, but we'll get into that in a second. Now, I do like the level layouts of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. They are short enough to where they don't feel like you're going to be trudging through a level too long, and they also are compact enough to where they can still have quite a bit of variety and different challenges put inside of them. Now, one thing I will say that Ripto's Rage does very well is in the mini-game challenges. See, inside of the first Spyro the Dragon game, you didn't really have mini-games inside of the levels. All you really had were Norks getting in your way as you try and find the dragons and the treasure all around. In Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, and continuing into Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon, you will have characters inside of the worlds that will offer you mini-games to complete them, and upon completing them, you will be rewarded. I like this because it makes Avalar, the world that you're inside of for Spyro 2, feel much bigger, and that these aren't just random levels that you just go into that are desolate and barren. No, these are levels that are homes to these people. And whatever is happening in those homes will affect Spyro later on, so it's always important to make sure to pay attention to what's going on inside whichever world you're in. Each world is different and unique, with some worlds actually interconnecting to one another, which is something that I find rather interesting that Spyro 2 would start doing that. And it's something that really only Spyro 2 does. You have some interactions with some of the home worlds and some of the other worlds in later Spyro games, but not to the degree that you really do in Spyro 2. At least in the original trilogy. I haven't played every Spyro game, so I don't know if this holds up true in later ones, but I do know this. Spyro 2 does very good world building without actually telling you too much about it. All of this stuff can be tracked down in your handy guidebook that is given to you by recurring character Alora the Fawn in order to keep track of all your talismans, gems, and orbs that you've collected through the game, as well as a new little collectible that is more hidden than some of the other ones, and those are skill points. Skill points are, just as they sound, hidden challenges that you can do in certain levels, such as getting a certain time in a speedway or defeating a certain number of enemies inside of a specific level, that unlock an epilogue for you in Dragon Shores. Get half of these skill points and you get a story epilogue of what happens to all the characters after you have beaten the game. Meanwhile, if you end up getting all the skill points, you get an unlock of a hidden bestiary of cut creatures as well as other creatures inside of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. Because much like how it was inside of Insomniac games for Ratchet and Clank, in Spyro the Dragon, each world has its own unique set of enemies and own unique set of residents, which, again, adds to that world building that I oh so love in games. Now, you do have a reason to collect treasures as well, because Spyro has an upgraded ability list in this game. See, thanks to everyone's, quote, favorite character, unquote, Moneybags, Spyro can learn different moves in each of the home worlds to help him go to previous worlds and complete challenges that he might not have been able to complete earlier because he did not know that move yet. Inside of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, the three abilities are the ability to swim, so water no longer hurts Spyro. Of course, lava and poison will. They will be denoted based on how they look and if you can jump on them safely or not. Or you have the ability to climb ladders, which seems rudimentary, but trust me, it's very helpful in Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage and later games. And then you have the Head Bash ability, which allows Spyro to break rocks, certain containers, as well as defeat enemies with a strong Skull Bash using his horns. Now, there is one other ability that is automatically given to you in Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, and that is the hover ability. Hovering is something that really helps you land when you are gliding in Spyro 2. And you perform this ability by jumping and gliding, then hitting the triangle button to hover in place and land, as opposed to the previous game where you would just fall straight down once you hit the triangle button and hoped that you would land where you needed to land. Spyro 2 really improves a lot of Spyro's movements and makes everything a lot more responsive and snappy, which is something I personally love when games do. Of course, there is an extreme when you go too far in that, but I think Spyro 2 hits that sweet spot of Spyro being able to move freely, but not snapping around and being too free in movement and feeling too loose. Another change that I mentioned would happen inside of the Spyro 1 review was how the charge was handled. Charging in Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage is a lot more responsive and a lot more snappy than it was with the weird arc you would do in Spyro 1. But there's other abilities Spyro can learn as well, thanks to the way that enemies are handled in Spyro 2. You have power-up gates that some minigames will require you to unlock by defeating a certain number of enemies inside of that level in particular, and then you will know that power-up is active because it will show you what that power-up does. If not, it'll tell you how many enemies you have to defeat in order to do it. Now, you have standard ones such as his higher jump, super flame breath, and then you have invincibility, but you also have the ability to glide permanently in stages and fly normally, but they're a little bit far and in between each other. And it's something that I think that the third Spyro game really perfects is these abilities. Now, when it comes to progression, once you collect enough talismans in the first two homeworlds, you'll be able to access the third homeworld. And you will fight a boss in each of the worlds and then end the game. See, unlike the first Spyro game where bosses were kind of just the stage themselves, in Spyro 2 and 3, they are actual bosses themselves, and once defeated in their specific arena, you will end up going over towards the new homeworld that you unlock upon beating them. And that ties more into the story of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, so why don't we get involved in what's going on in the world of Avalar, and why is Spyro there in the first place? Our story begins with Spyro and Sparks trying to escape a rainstorm inside of the Dragon Realms and being sick and tired of seeing nothing but clouds and rain for miles upon miles. After seeing the Dragon Shores portal, they decided to head on over there since they hadn't been to that resort since they kicked Nasty Nork's butt. Where exactly did Dragon Shores come from? Don't worry about it. Also, don't worry about the fact that it's run entirely by Norks. I'm sure that is perfectly legit and perfectly fine. Anyway, upon entering the Dragon Shores portal, they end up getting pulled into the world of Avalar because at the same time, three beings from Avalar are trying to get a dragon in order to deal with their despotic ruler, Ripto, who had recently come to Avalar and had already made a mess of the place, and they want him gone. These three beings, known as Alora the Fawn, Hunter the Cheetah, and the Professor, a mole, decide to bring a dragon over because upon the first time they meet Ripto, they hear from him that dragons are the one thing that Ripto hates, and hate is a very apt comparison word to use here, because the moment Ripto, who ends up seeing that there's something going on in the world of Glimmer where they're pulling Spyro into, sees Spyro and goes into an absolute fit. Because he goes into a fit though, he ends up losing his scepter and thus has to retreat to the Summer Forest. So, after dealing with Ripto and getting an introduction to our main villain of the game, we end up seeing Spyro end up getting a guidebook from Alora telling about what the world of Avalar is, where to go, and that Spyro should meet her in the Summer Forest. So, that's pretty much the plot. Spyro was kind of kidnapped against his will, and now has to deal with the despotic ruler, who, again, I have to remind you, had not only been in Avalar for a few weeks, and already messed up the place and his reputation so much that everyone wants him gone, or worse, dead. So, now we have to go through each of the worlds in order to be able to kick Ripto out of all 3 castles inside of the Summer Forest, Autumn Plains, and Winter Tundra. Deal with him, and get to Dragon Shores so we can get that well-earned vacation that we so desperately need. And while we are dealing with the problem of Ripto, we're also dealing with the problem of Avalar, because a lot of the worlds in Avalar don't get along with each other. Especially as seen inside of the Autumn Plains, where 2 of the homeworlds are actually actively at war with each other, the Breeze Builders and the people of Zephyr. So yeah, not too much kumbaya going around in the world of Avalar, and thanks to Spyro interfering in each of the worlds and solving the problems of the locals, it's actually said by the end of the game that the people of Avalar are actually getting along with one another, which is a nice little positive change to have. It's also nice to know that apparently these homeworlds can go to war with each other, which is kind of concerning. The Zephyr Breeze Builder conflict is kind of glossed over, but in reality, it's actually very dark. But what are the 3 lackeys that we have to deal with? Well, we have Ripto, of course. Small, short, angry, red, and quite the violent one. You hear him right from the first instance you hear him that he just wants to kill the fairies that are inside of the game and just gets completely sick of everything around him. It's implied that he was banished to another realm and was brought over because Hunter ended up typing inside the professor's super portal the code that accidentally freed him, which turns out to be Hunter's birthday. But as a result of that, he ends up taking over pretty quickly and right away, since there are no dragons to stop him. Along with Ripto, you have 2 of his lackeys, Crush and Gulp, who are brainless, mute, and all the brawn that Ripto needs. They're also a lot taller than him, but Ripto, being a skilled sorcerer, is able to keep them in line. You have a bunch of different worlds to deal with, but none of them really give their opinions on Ripto while you're there. You only take it up to Alora's word that Ripto is bad, and honestly through his actions it shows how bad he is anyway, but it would have been nice to hear how he's messing with some of the other worlds around in Avalar, rather than just, dealing with the local problems that are going on, and then moving on, and then eventually getting to Ripto. It's a small nitpick, but for a simple story as it is, especially how the first game was rather simple, I think that this works as a plot line, because Ripto, you're not meant to root for him. He is clearly defined from the first cutscene you see of him that he is bad, he's annoying, and he is very temperamental. At the end of the game, you end up fighting Ripto after beating him in the Autumn Plains, and seeing that he fell to his supposed demise, you notice that he comes back because Moneybags, the, aristocrat of Avalar, who makes you pay through most of the worlds that you go through in order to progress, decided to sell Ripto bombs in order to be able to get his revenge. You know what? Gotta respect the hustle of late-stage capitalism in Avalar. Anyway, after beating Ripto one last time inside of the Winter Tundra in his arena, Ripto sinks in a bunch of lava, and you would think that would be the end, but according to the epilogue, he is actually survived and is picked up by a dragon, but it was played off more for jokes. We'll get more into that once we get to Spyro 3 or the Dragon's epilogue, which expands a little bit more into it. But that's the story of Spyro 2, Ripto's Rage. Ripto is bad, you gotta torch him, and free the people of Avalar while also solving Avalar's problems. Again, it works, and part of that is due to the fact that the music in the game and the sound design once again remains top-notch, along with how the level design works, in just making everything feel grandiose in scale, while also small enough and manageable enough to where it's not overwhelming. So, why don't we get into the sound design of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage and see just how well Stuart Copeland and all the sound team put together this amazing sequel. Now, I mentioned in the previous review that subsequent reviews for the Spyro the Dragon series by Insomniac Games wouldn't pay too much attention to the music or the voice acting and sound design. There are some changes, but we're gonna go over them right now and also talk about the Reignited trilogy a little bit when it comes to how the game was handled in the Reignited trilogy for Spyro 2. So, when it comes to sound design, it once again is top-notch in the original and inside the Reignited trilogy for that matter. With both versions having crisp and crunchy sound effects, everything has a good weight to them whenever you breathe fire, break boxes, beat up enemies, break through barriers. The whole thing is still here, just like how it was in Spyro 1. At the same time, having Stuart Copeland return for the rest of the series was a smart move, because Stuart Copeland's music adds very good ambiance to the entirety of the game. Even though there is a little bit of a weird thing where the music will fade out and then restart instead of having it naturally loop, something that even the Reignited trilogy didn't really do, but I can ignore that because the music in Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage is just so good. If I had to choose between the two soundtracks, I will honestly say I think Spyro 1 has the more memorable soundtrack, but Spyro 2 is no slouch in the soundtrack department at all. If I had to rank the games, I would go, honestly, 1, 2, 3, with third being my least favorite, but we'll get into that once we get into the Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon review. So, I also didn't mention the sound design team by name in the last review, but I do feel like it is worth mentioning these hardworking individuals who brought together a great game. We have Michael Gollum as the sound designer for Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, as well as the rest of the Spyro series, up until Spyro 4 Enter the Dragonfly. We have Ron Horowitz as the supervising sound editor, making sure the mixing was very good and that nothing was overpowering, even with how soft Ripto can speak sometimes in his rageful voice. Jeff Sates as the sound engineer, and Harry Woolwery as the sound effects editor. All four of them led a team that did a fantastic job on bringing the sound effects in Spyro 2 just overall to light. It's great. Now, what about the voice acting? The voice acting is where we're going to get into quite a bit of things. And I mentioned in the last review that Carlos Alazraqui did not return as the voice of Spyro the Dragon, and instead it would be replaced by Tom Kenny, who would also go on to voice other characters in the Spyro series going forward. Tom Kenny in this game, besides voicing Spyro, also voices the Professor, the Electrolls, and additional voices for other citizens of Avalar, as well as voicing many of the citizens in Avalar in the Reignited trilogy, as well as returning as the main voice for Spyro for all three games. Greg Berger does a fantastic villain in Ripto, and would actually return in the Reignited trilogy to voice Ripto as well, and voices many of the other citizens, such as Hunter the Cheetah in the original Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, the Foreman, Master Chef from the Sunny Beach, Breeze Builders from Breeze Harbor, Crush and Gulp for Ripto's minions, and the Yeti from Colossus. Now, inside of the Reignited trilogy, Hunter the Cheetah would instead be voiced by Robbie Daymond, and would go on to voice Hunter in both 2 and 3, with Greg Berger being only returning for his role as Ripto inside of the Reignited trilogy. For Elora the Fawn, we have Melissa Disney, who also voiced Greta, the one of 2 agents that work for the Professor, the Inventor Droid in Metropolis, the Hippos in Shady Oasis, as well as additional voices all around, while inside the Reignited trilogy, Elora was voiced by Cassandra Lee Morris instead. For everyone's favorite greedy moneybags, we have in the Reignited trilogy, J.B. Blanc voicing the greedy bear, while in the original game we have Milton James, who also voiced Basil the Explorer and Bombo the Flagkeeper, later named to Bob inside of the Reignited trilogy. Now, Milton James is interesting as Moneybags does return in later of the Spyro games, but he does not return to voice Moneybags to my knowledge. To my knowledge, I believe Moneybags in the 3rd game is voiced by a completely different voice actor, which is interesting because it's the only instance of that really happening where returning characters are changed for their voices. For Zoe the Fairy, who would save our progress, we have Mary Linda Phillips in the original Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, as well as voicing Queen Finny in Ocean Speedway, and Stella inside of another one of these Spyro worlds that I honestly don't remember because there's so many names in Spyro 2. In Spyro Reignited trilogy, Catherine Taber voices Zoe the Fairy instead. Finally, we have Marcelo Tubert voicing the Classic Monks, the Bone Builders from Skelos Badlands, and the Ice Builders from Glacier Peak, as well as additional voices. We do not know who they were voiced by in the Spyro Reignited trilogy, as they were seen as side extra characters, and if anyone knows who voices them inside of Reignited, I would greatly appreciate pointing me in the right direction so I can give them the correct and necessary shoutouts. I know that the Colossus Monks are Max Middleman, who voices some of the dragons inside of the game as well for Spyro 1. And I believe the Bone Builders and everyone are still uncredited roles, which is a shame. But yes, there's a lot to really explore with the voice talent that was used in Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. And it all came together to just form a very good and cohesive narrative and really good performances all around. I can't think of a single performance in Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage that I honestly did not like. And that's very rare for me for a lot of games, because there's always usually 1 or 2 performances I'm not too keen on, but I like to think that everyone had fun on this project, and it really reflected that in their work. So, I guess it's about time we wrap up this review now, and I give my final thoughts on the game, and how we should play Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. So, that's Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. Another success by Insomniac Games allowed them to make another 3rd game in the series before they would move on to greener pastures with the Ratchet & Clank series, a series that still goes on to this day. I will say, Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage is always fun to play through for me. I know a lot of it is nostalgia in this case, but I think the game holds up both graphically and sound design wise, as well as gameplay wise, very well. More so than a lot of other PS1 games for that matter. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to play only the PlayStation 1 original. The Reignited trilogy does a very good job of updating the visuals as well as the controls for Spyro in general. I will say the only thing that's kind of annoying in Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage for Reignited is that because everything is more designed, some of the initial charm of the blob creatures and citizens of Avalar is a little bit lost, but it's not too bad. At the same time, it can be difficult to find gems at times, but that's why you have that handy little gem radar by holding the 4 shoulder buttons on a PlayStation or Xbox controller. So how does this tie into what we have with the rest of the series? Well, there's only one game left in the Spyro the Dragon series made by Insomniac Games, and that is Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon, released in 2000 for the PlayStation 1. They really went nuts with those 1-year release dates back then. And I will say that while I do enjoy Spyro 3, it's got a lot that I think showed that Insomniac was starting to get burnt out of the Purple Dragon. But how can you play Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage nowadays? Well, there's no shortage of ways to play it, both of the Reignited trilogy that is on every single system known to man at this point, or the PlayStation 1 original, which is available on the PSN store, which could allow it to be played on the PSP, the PS3, it can be played on a PS1 and a PS2, as well as, if you live in Europe, it can be played on a PlayStation Vita as well. That functionality was cut out of the United States because of licensing issues, but hey, options are there, and my goodness, are there a lot of options. So, I think Spyro really shows that Insomniac can take what they've already refined and make it all the much better than when it was originally made. And with how well the Reignited trilogy was received, I like to think that people definitely would love another Spyro game, a proper Spyro 4 at that, rather than what we got with Enter the Dragonfly. But that's neither here nor there. Ripto was a very good villain, and honestly kind of received the Dr. Nefarious treatment, as I like to call it, when it comes to reusing a villain from the Spyro series. Ripto ended up becoming the de facto reused villain in multiple games, which is kind of funny in retrospect because it's kind of annoying in the Ratchet & Clank series, and it's also kind of annoying in the Spyro series, so they share that in common as well. But anyway, everyone, I'm going to end it off right here. This has been Neronium, and I thank you all for watching my review of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. Stay tuned for the next one, which will cap off this Spyro trilogy with Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon. But until then, everyone, I'll see you all next time, and hope you have a good rest of your summer.